Meridian, Sir Carlton Lawrence. Prelude. After a massive solar flare plunges America into darkness, 7 complete strangers from different parts of the country experience a series of inexplicable events that defy logic and require their collective wit to navigate. Though a bond is forged between 6 of them, there's something off about the 7th member of this impromptu group. Understanding who he is will soon become a matter of life and death as the group becomes trapped along a narrow corridor of I-70 in America's heartland. Chapter 1. Skyrockets in Flight. When you're neophobic, a breakup can be terrifying, even when you know it's for the best. Whether its cause is eagerness or dread, the resulting anxiety can make it hard to sleep. And Cassie had been averaging less than 4 hours for weeks. Still living in her hometown of Miami, Oklahoma, though he was good to her, Cassie never loved the man she had been with for almost a decade, going back to their junior year in high school. After years of stalling, she finally told Shane she needed space. Miami was a tiny town with a population under 15,000, so for Cassie, space was a relative term. First, it meant getting her own place. However, after a month, it seemed Cassie and Shane were destined to run into one another daily. So Cassie began considering a change of venue. Doing so would require her to find a job in another town, preferably far enough away to greatly reduce the possibility of an unplanned encounter with her ex. It wasn't so much that she wanted to avoid him. She just didn't want to let her guard down in a moment of weakness and suddenly find herself back in the relationship again. Been there, done that. Miami is situated on the northeast corner of Oklahoma, near the convergence of Oklahoma, Arkansas, Kansas, and Missouri. With experience under her belt running small, locally owned retail stores and shops, Cassie figured she could find work in most any larger town and considered Tulsa a logical place to check out, since she had a cousin living there. Despite that fact, the thought of moving anywhere made her heart race. During another sleepless night, rather than take a leap of faith by moving to Tulsa without a job, Cassie decided to take some baby steps first. She really needed a vacation. After awaking from what was more just a cat nap than actual sleep, Cassie planned to pack for a month-long midsummer driving adventure across the Midwest, checking out any points of interest along the way. Accordingly, she decided against following a schedule other than simply driving until she felt compelled to stop. As small and obscure as Miami, Oklahoma is, Winfield, Alabama was less than half its size. When Mike graduated from Winfield High School and enrolled at Auburn University, the campus felt like a mega city. After breezing through undergraduate school, Mike left Auburn for the even larger town of Charlottesville, Virginia, to obtain an MBA from UVA's Darden School of Business, landing a dream job with the national home builder D.R. Horton in Arlington, Texas. Mike ultimately relocated to an even bigger city and started making bank. After a year in training, Mike was promoted to the position of development manager and was initially assigned to 2 luxury subdivision projects. Before these were even built out, he was assigned 2 more. His annual salary quickly climbed above a couple $100,000, and after just his 4th year at Horton, his annual bonus was over $500,000 before taxes. Getting home from work at midnight one Tuesday and setting the alarm for 4 a.m. to prep for a 7 a.m. meeting with his superiors the next morning, Mike asked himself, what good is the money if I don't ever have time to enjoy it? In the meeting that following day, the head of the development division mentioned that a new investor group intended to place $100 million with the company to begin converting entire luxury neighborhoods into posh Airbnb communities near vacation-friendly destinations. As Mike listened, his boss mentioned a catch saying, "The investment is tax motivated and we must have the entire fund committed before the end of the year." That declaration caused a few quips from the staff about officially moving Christmas to January 25th, but the sarcastic humor failed to amuse Mike. Instead, he stood to address the room by saying, "Gentlemen, I've been studying Airbnb trends. It's about to implode." Mike's immediate boss seemed to want to hear more and asked Mike to continue. Much like speculation and subprime lending results in an overheated housing market and collapse way back in 2008, during the past 5 years, over-leveraged mom-and-pop investors have been buying up Airbnb properties en masse, using variable rate loans. With the feds expected to try and put the brakes on inflation, you can bet we're on the cusp of a rate reset. When that happens, these undercapitalized mom and pops will be forced to dump their properties, which could be the perfect catalyst to make the collapse of 2008 look like child's play. "Sit down, Mr. Span," cited Mike's boss's boss. "I was already worth over $25 million when I was your age, so your opinion is as insignificant to me as a gnat on a fat cow's ass. We're doing this deal, and the beauty of it is even if you're right, it's the investors that are shit out of luck, not us. We're just merchant developers here, and we get paid either way." Though Mike sat down as instructed and didn't say another word during the hours-long meeting, he also didn't pay attention to anything else that was said as he began crafting his resignation letter in his head. A month later, he was taking a year away from work to spend some of his severance pay. After his hiatus, he'd find a job that actually served some greater purpose other than simply enriching a greedy few. Ironically, as the year unfolded, the Airbnb bubble burst in epic fashion. The investor group sued Horton for investing its funds in bad faith, and both Mike's boss and the loudmouth big boss were unceremoniously fired from Horton. Crisscrossing the Midwest, Cassie was now in Missouri and barreling northbound along I-44 with the windows down. The forced breezes caused her shoulder-length brown hair to fly in all directions, and she loved the sensation. After noticing several signs advertising Merrimack Caverns, Cassie decided to take the Stanton exit to check out the caves. As was the plan, she called her cousin in Tulsa to check in and let her know where she'd likely spend the night. For some reason, the call didn't go through. Stopping to buy a ticket, Cassie was directed to board a shuttle that would ferry her and several others from the parking area to just inside the mouth of the cave. After entering the cave and disembarking from the shuttle, she found the cavern so amazing that she completely lost track of time, until the tour guide and driver chimed in that the bus would be departing for the visitors' parking area in 30 minutes. The shuttle was a fairly basic white Nextbus mini school bus that could accommodate a driver and 14 passengers. However, as the day was winding down, besides Cassie, there were only 6 other tourists. Several were seemingly frustrated that their cell phones wouldn't work inside the cave, though the tour guide seemed surprised that they didn't. As the bus left the shelter of the cave, Cassie and the other riders noticed that the entire sky seemed to glow as if it was on fire. Now outside the cave, the driver was also unsuccessful in reaching anyone by phone, and by the time the bus reached the visitors' parking area, he seemed completely unnerved. He was the first one to leave the bus and made a beeline for the visitor center without saying a word to his guests. Cassie never saw him again. One by one, the bewildered tourists walked to their cars, but none would start. After they each realized that they may be stranded, the group returned to the visitor center, which was now locked. An athletic guy about 30 was the first to speak to the group, saying, "Well, this is weird. Can anyone call 911? Most everyone shook their heads, indicating their phones were not working. "Guys, My name is Mike. I'm up from Dallas, or Arlington to be exact. I suggest we get comfortable and wait a little while longer for someone to come back and check on us. Surely our driver went for help." Only an older man, about 55, initially responded to Mike. "I'm an ex-cop. No need to wait. Break the glass. There's a landline in there." He was a slender black man with white hair, stood about 6'2", and though he was not powerfully built, he looked as if he knew how to handle himself. He approached Mike and held out his hand formally to introduce himself, saying, "Hi, Mike. I'm Charles. I was a cop in Charleston, South Carolina, until I recently retired." After shaking hands with Charles, Mike addressed the group again, saying, "Okay, what do y'all think? Should we break the glass and go into the building?" Though the others seemed uninterested in responding, Cassie wasn't bashful. "We can't stay here all night, so break in. Use one of those landscaping pavers along the walkway." Mike appreciated her frank demeanor and quick thinking. Being careful not to cut himself, Mike smashed the French door and reached through the broken glass to manually unlock the deadbolt. Though an alarm light began flashing, there was no audible alarm. Furthermore, there were no working lights inside the building. Seeing a wall-mounted key hook near the front door, Charles chuckled, "I can tell I'm not in Charleston anymore." Coming from a small town where everyone knew everyone and no one ever locked their doors, Cassie asked Charles what he meant by the comment. "The front door is glass and the deadbolt is a single cylinder. I have yet to find a security camera, and they keep the keys to the bus just inside the door. Where I come from, that's a damn invitation." Seeing Mike hang up the landline while shaking his head, Charles could tell he was deep in thought. "What are you thinking, my man?" Motioning for Charles to come close enough to him so that the others couldn't hear their conversation, the two are quickly joined by Cassie, who was equally curious about Mike's thoughts. Mike would only talk to them in hushed tones, saying, "The landline is down. Verizon is down. What service do you guys use?" Cassie indicated that she used Verizon too, but Charles was with T-Mobile and it was also down. "So all the phones are down? None of our vehicles will start, and the power grid seems to be offline," Mike continued. "And we're out here in the middle of nowhere," Cassie added. Walking back toward the entrance of the building, Mike grabbed the keys to the shuttle, saying, "I have a theory." Cassie and Charles followed him to the bus while the others watched. Climbing into the driver's seat and depressing the foot clutch, Mike put the key into the ignition switch and turned the key. After it cranked without issue, most everyone applauded. Just to be sure, Mike shut off the engine, which prompted Charles to exclaim, "I hope you didn't just cost us our ride out of here." Without responding, Mike turned the key again and achieved the same positive result. This time, when he turned off the motor, he exited the bus and motioned for everyone to come close enough to hear him. "Folks, I believe the power grid in this area and possibly beyond is down due to a cyber or EMP attack. Given the fact that none of our cars will start, I'm thinking EMP." A preppy-looking white dude that looked as if he'd never performed a day of manual labor in his life spoke up, saying, "2 questions. First, what's an EMP attack and why isn't the bus affected when the other vehicles are?" Charles answered both questions before Mike could. Electromagnetic pulse attack, and the bus was protected from it by the cave. Mike elaborated further, saying an EMP outage or attack has been a concern of Homeland Security for a couple of decades. The Russians, the Chinese, and certainly the North Koreans have been developing the technology for use as a superweapon. The preppy dude replied, "What about us? America?" Mike responded before Charles could. "Friend, what is your name?" "Call me Burn." "As in Burn?" Charles asked. The guy replied, "No, Burn as in Bernard. If your folks named you that, I bet you'd also want to be called Burn." Everybody chuckled and needed to. The guy continued, "So it could be even our own government?" Before anyone could speculate further, Cassie approached and held her hand out to the oldest-looking member of the group, who was a weathered but seemingly fit woman, maybe in her 70s, and like Charles, her hair was white. She told Cassie her first name was Mary, but that she couldn't remember her last name. Byrne chuckled, thinking the woman was trying to be humorous, but Cassie wasn't so sure. Cassie then turned to an attractive African-American woman who, up to that moment, had seemed detached and disengaged from the group. She said her name was Kim. Leaning against the bus, the seventh and final member of the tour group was even less responsive than Kim, simply grunting something inaudible when asked his name. Cassie remembered that both to and from the cave, the man sat in the lone single seat next to the emergency exit at the very back of the bus and refused to make eye contact with her. Mike took the conversation back over. Guys, we're just a dozen or so miles from Stanton, but it's just an hour or so further to the St. Louis area. I'd be willing to bet we'll learn more about whatever is going on in the city. What do y'all think, Stanton or St. Louis? Charles spoke first. If the phones and computers are down, then nobody in a small town like Stanton will know anything more than we do. I have a buddy in the St. Louis PD, so if you get me to headquarters, we should be able to get the full picture. Everyone but the rider who wouldn't identify himself agreed. That fellow gave Cassie the creeps. A diminutive white dude wearing a dark hoodie in the summertime seems to reek of drug dealer status. But to Cassie, there was something more sinister to him than even that. When the guy waved everyone off and began heading back to the visitor center, Cassie, and probably a few others, were relieved that apparently he wouldn't be making the trip with them to St. Louis. Chapter 2. Wheels on the Bus. Before calling on everyone to board the bus, Mike saw Cassie and Kim engaged in a conversation and used the opportunity to call Charles over to the side for a private discussion. This time, Mike didn't want Cassie to insert herself into their conversation. "Hey, Charles," Mike began yet again at a subdued volume. "There's some weird shit already going on around us. It could get even weirder once we get to St. Louis. With you being an ex-cop, I assume you're packing?" Instead of answering, Charles simply grinned and patted his hip. Seeing a look of relief on Mike's face, Charles then reached down to pat his left calf. But before Mike could respond to that gesture, Charles then reached into the back of his pants and stealthily produced a third pistol for only Mike to see. Pulling Mike close to him with one arm, Charles used the other to secretively place a fourth weapon, a semi-automatic 9mm Beretta, in Mike's hand. "Don't let me put you out," Mike jokingly responded. "I'd hate for you to be outgunned on my account." Charles's grin never left his face as he whispered in Mike's ear, "Don't worry, my friend. I still have several others." "I'm pretty sure I don't want to touch one of those," Mike replied. Charles then had a couple of questions for Mike. "I assume you can drive this shuttle bus. Oh, and can you handle a gun?" Without directly answering Charles this time, it was Mike's turn to flash a toothy grin. Not only did the two men seem to like each other, they seemed to trust one another as well. Mike slipped the holstered Beretta into his right front pants pocket. Seeing him do so, and this time at full volume, Charles playfully chastised him, simply saying, "Rookie!" Then Charles called for everyone to board the bus. By now, the western sky was only slightly orange, and without the lights of the idle bus, the darkness was beginning to consume everything around the group. Before getting on the bus, Cassie mentioned that there were no stars shining in the night sky. Furthermore, the waning moon that had dominated the sky just the night before was nowhere to be seen. She leaned into Mike and asked him what he heard, and Mike responded by saying, "Nothing. That's exactly my point," Cassie continued. "Shouldn't we be hearing an orchestra of birds and buzzing insects? Neither one of us hears a thing." Mike realized she was right, and the weirdness of the night continued to get weirder. 10 minutes later, they were doing 70 miles an hour while heading east-northeast on Interstate 44. In either direction, they didn't see another car, and the headlights of the bus seemed to be the only illumination in any direction for miles. Charles was the first to notice the green reflective sign indicating the bus was within 48 miles of St. Louis. "How's our gas?" he asked Mike. Charles had positioned himself right behind Mike in order to talk confidentially to him about anything unusual along the way. Behind Charles, Cassie and Kim were sitting next to one another, still engaged in conversation. Across the aisle from them sat Byrne, and Mary sat across the aisle and behind Byrne, seemingly not interested in talking to anyone. "We have pretty close to a full tank," Mike responded to Charles, who simply acknowledged Mike by nodding his head. After another half an hour, both Charles and Mike saw another sign that indicated they were closer to St. Louis, but still 35 miles away. "How fast you going?" Charles asked Mike, who replied, 70. Charles pressed him further. "You sure? Any chance you let off the gas without realizing it?" "Charles," Mike replied, almost annoyed, "I've been doing 70 the entire time we've been on I-44. Suddenly, a highway sign came into view that indicated St. Louis was ahead, but that they were now on I-70. Simultaneously, the pair blurted out, "WTF," for all to hear. Before they could explain to the others their confusion, another sign indicated that St. Louis was still 52 miles away. At the next mile marker, Mike pulled the bus over to the shoulder so Charles could investigate. Something, anything. As Charles climbed back aboard, he suddenly drew his pistol and pointed it toward the back of the bus. "Let me see your hands," he shouted as he approached an unexpected rider in the solitary back seat of the bus next to the emergency exit. It was the white dude in the black hoodie that Cassie figured was a drug dealer. Though he extended his hands as commanded, the strange rider seemed as surprised as those around him. Despite sensing the man's confusion, Charles continued to press for answers. "Why did you sneak back on the bus at the visitor center? When did you sneak back on the bus? Who are you?" Charles thought the guy said his name was Ben, but then he was not forthcoming with any other answers. When Charles demanded to know Ben's last name, Mary, the elderly loner, spoke for the first time on the trip, saying, "Maybe he's like me." Cassie got up from her seat and sat down beside Mary, who she felt sorry for and wanted to comfort. "What do you mean, Mary?" Cassie asked her. "I told you back at Merrimack Caverns that I can't remember my last name. Am I in trouble too?" Cassie consoled her by saying, "Of course not, and neither is Ben," hiding the uneasiness that Ben had made her feel, even before stowing away on the bus under everyone's noses. Charles lowered his gun but walked backwards to Mike without taking his eyes off Ben. Leaning close enough for only Mike to hear, Charles offered a couple of his own theories about how the creepy dude in the hoodie may have made it back onto the bus without anyone noticing. Maybe he previously propped open the emergency door, or maybe he got on the bus when we were all looking up into the night skies. Hell, it was dark enough that he could have just boarded the bus before we left the visitor center and fell fast asleep down in the seats, Charles hypothesized. "Or maybe Scotty beamed him aboard," Mike sarcastically replied, completely devoid of any humor. "But as weird as that is, I'm more freaked out about how we jumped interstates and lost ground after almost 2 hours of driving. And there's one more thing. We still have a full tank of gas." Charles opened his eyes wide in disbelief and then returned to one more tangible problem. "Byrne, get up here," Charles ordered the preppy boy. "Can you drive a stick shift?" "No." Charles switched strategies. "Can you handle a gun?" "No." Feeling disdain for the guy, Charles then asked him, "Bernard, what can you do besides spend your daddy's money?" Mike didn't think the guy deserved to be belittled so badly. "Lay off him, Charles. Byrne, you need to help Charles keep an eye on Sleeping Beauty back there." Before Byrne could respond, Charles apologized to him, but then Byrne offered more alarming facts. "Guys, at one point before we stopped, I went to the back of the bus to look out the back window. When I did, the dude wasn't on the bus. I'm telling you both, it's like he materialized out of thin air somehow." Charles softened his tone further and put his arm around Burns' shoulder as if welcoming him to some private club or protectorate, and then said to him, "We can speculate all we want about how he got on the bus, but the fact is he's here now, so we need to watch him. I'm going to move him up one row and sit behind him. Burn, you sit across the aisle from him and don't take your eyes off him until we get to St. Louis." Semi-protesting, but only enough to not set Charles off again, Byrne asked Charles and Mike what he was supposed to do if the guy started acting hostile. Figuring Byrne would likely struggle to do a single push-up, Mike reached beside the driver's seat and removed a fire extinguisher from its bracket mounts. "Spray him in the eyes with this," Mike replied, "and feel free to drown him in it." Before the bus began rolling again, Charles was in the rear seat immediately behind Ben. Both Cassie and Kim moved up to sit immediately behind Mike, while Mary simply returned to her original seat as if nothing was any different or extraordinary. Apparently, Cassie was much more observant than Mike. Leaning as close to his right ear as possible, she asked him to tell her how many gas stations or fast food restaurants he'd observed on the trip. When he replied, "None," due to the infinite blackness of the night, she then refined her question. "Well then," she continued, "how many signs along the interstate have you seen advertising a gas station or restaurant? Or anything for that matter?" Mike realized the answer was 0, and that made him all the more uncomfortable. As he considered the context of Cassie's question, he began to realize that her mind likely worked faster than his and Charles's combined gray matter. "Instead of answering you, let me ask you a question, Cassie," Mike replied. Thinking about Charles, the walking weapons depot that was now sitting in the back seat, "can you handle a gun?" Without saying anything, Cassie reached into her purse and pulled out a Glock 19 pistol. Though the night was becoming beyond stressful, she grinned, almost demonically at Mike, but in an innocent-sounding tone asked him, "You mean something like this?" Mike was really beginning to like this girl, who seemed to exude street smarts, book smarts, and confidence, all with perfect timing and elegance. It didn't hurt that she was also drop-dead gorgeous. A half an hour later, Mike was the first to see a sign illuminated by the headlights of the bus. It indicated that Indianapolis, and not St. Louis, was 20 miles away. It was almost more than Mike could take without cursing at the top of his lungs. Instead, he slowed and eventually stopped the bus. "Watch him, Byrne," Charles instructed the guard armed with the fire extinguisher as he left his self-assigned post and approached Mike. Rarely taking his eyes off Ben, Charles had not seen the sign. "What now?" he asked Mike. "Well, you won't believe me, but what the hell? We're now less than 20 miles from the city." "Shit! We should have been there 10 times over by now," Charles interrupted. Mike was determined to finish his sentence. "Of Indianapolis, and we're almost on empty." "Indianapolis?" Charles exclaimed. Cassie interjected herself into the conversation. "Guys, whether we're nearest to St. Louis or Indianapolis or London, England for that matter, just take the next exit. We need gas, snacks, drinks, and I need to pee. If the first gas station is closed, then go to the next one. If that one is also closed, then just slam the bus into the glass storefront and make a new door. At this point, I could care less." The look Charles gave Mike let Mike know that they were thinking the exact same thing. This gal needs to be in charge. Sure enough, as Mike shifted gears and the bus started rolling again, almost immediately, its headlights illuminated a sign advertising a Chevron gas station at the next exit. Though the entire exit was deserted, the front door of the Chevron station was standing open. Charles and Byrne stayed on the bus to watch over Ben, while the others grabbed water and supplies, while Mike examined the fuel pumps, but none were working. When everyone returned to the bus, Mike spoke up for all to hear, saying, "The pumps are off. We were able to stock up on drinks and snacks, but we can't go much further before we run out of gas. I suggest we stay here until daylight, and surely then we'll see some activity and figure out how to get with the local authorities." Ben sat motionless through the entire stop with his eyes closed. But upon hearing Mike mention the local authorities, he suddenly sprang into action and bolted for the exit door. Charles reacted by raising his pistol, intending to fire a warning shot into the night. But before he could squeeze the trigger, Burns' late errant blast with the fire extinguisher missed its intended target and instead hit Charles squarely in the face, temporarily blinding him. In an instant, Ben, the mystery rider, was out the emergency door and quickly disappeared into the black night. Mike could tell that Charles struggled to resist the urge to shoot Byrne in the foot or maybe some other extremity. Instead, he asked for Byrne's shirt in order to use it like a towel. Byrne didn't hesitate to remove it and handed it over to Charles so he could wipe his face or even his ass if he wanted to. Byrne the nerd knew better than to protest to Charles's request. Chapter 3. All aboard! Though the shuttle was not built for comfort on long trips, as the adrenaline subsided, none of the 6 remaining riders had trouble falling asleep on the idle bus. Mike's last conscious thought before falling into a heavy slumber was wondering if he'd ever see daylight again. Several hours later, he woke to the sound of rain pelting the bus, but it was still pitch black outside. So he closed his eyes and went back to sleep. When he woke the second time, it was daylight, though the rain was still coming down in buckets. Sensing somebody's presence near him, Mike turned his head to see Charles standing on the exit steps, peering out into the rain. "Not a good day for anyone to be out on foot in this weather," he exclaimed, presumably to Mike, though other riders were starting to stir. "At least we're out of that infernal darkness," Mike replied. Mary was awake and drenched, apparently having left the bus to use the bathroom before anyone else was awake. Seeing her discomfort, Cassie offered to sprint into the store and grab some paper towels so Mary could dry off a little. Byrne asked her to find some caffeine, preferably coffee. "Good luck with that," Charles mused. "Diet Mountain Dew is my next choice," Byrne yelled to Cassie as she left the bus. When she returned to hand Mary some paper towels and Byrne a 20-ounce lukewarm soda, she then displayed a mop bucket for the other women to see, for future use as a chamber pot during the persistent rain. Mike asked if she encountered anyone else in the store. "Not a soul," she replied. Looking at Mike, Charles suggested they drive around in hopes of finding a gas station with a backup generator. "Is everyone ready to drive around this ghost town?" Mike asked the group. When he cranked the engine and the gauges sprang to life, Charles looked over his shoulder. Sensing his objective, Mike confirmed what Charles was seeing by saying, "Between an 1/8 and a 1/16 of a tank." Charles responded, "I'm not optimistic any of these stores in this podunk town will have a generator." As Mike pulled the bus up to the gas pumps of a second station, it was also deserted. Still, he braved the rain to get out and try to fill up. When he was unsuccessful, he returned to the bus and shook his head. "We're probably better off being stranded here than out on the interstate somewhere. So let's wait for the rain to let up and find some houses where we can go door to door looking for help," Cassie suggested. At that moment, Cassie noticed Mary was pointing at something she saw from her window. Cassie trained her eyes in the direction Mary was pointing, but didn't see anything at first. Suddenly she exclaimed, "Yes! I see her, Mary! Someone is out there!" Mike and Charles had yet to see anyone. "Where?" they each asked, almost in unison. Cassie responded by also pointing in the same direction as Mary. "By the shoe store! It's a woman!" Byrne then chimed in, "Guys, am I the only one who's more than a little freaked out right now?" Though they wouldn't admit it, Mike and Charles were too. But before they could process the situation further, Cassie was out of the bus and running toward the woman to offer assistance and shelter on the bus. By the time she returned with the drenched woman, Cassie already knew her name. "Everyone, this is Robin," Cassie announced. Robin was talkative and seemed as freaked out as the bus riders after having experienced a similar series of strange events. Robin explained, "I work at the shoe shop and I was about to lock up yesterday when the phones went out. There was a single customer in the store and we both commented on how strange the sunset looked. The next thing I remember, I was trying to start my car, but it wouldn't crank. And then I thought the whole town was deserted until I saw you guys," she elaborated as Cassie retrieved more paper towels. "Do you live in town?" Charles asked Robin, who replied, "No, I'm 2 exits west of here, about 7 miles or so." Charles looked at Mike and asked if he thought the bus could make it to Robin's place. When Mike nodded in the affirmative, Charles told Robin they'd be happy to give her a ride home. "Do you live alone?" Charles inquired. "I still live with my parents," Robin replied. "Well, maybe they will know what the heck is going on around here," Charles replied. Within a few minutes, the bus was back on the interstate, and by this time it was heading west. As soon as Mike noticed the first I-70 sign, the ominous feeling of apprehension returned from the night before. "Hey, Charles, come here a sec, please," Mike requested, trying to sound nonchalant. When Charles leaned over his shoulder, Mike placed his right index finger on the fuel gauge and tapped on it. It now registered a full tank. Though the two didn't comment further, Cassie caught the look they gave one another and glanced at the gauge herself. After passing the first exit, Mike called to Robin, asking, "So the next exit is yours?" Without looking, she called to him, "Take the Franklin Road exit and keep right." Like the night before, more than 7 miles seemed to go by when Robin finally looked out her window and then said, "I don't recognize any of this. Are we still on I-70? Before he could respond, Mike noticed an upcoming sign with the familiar I-70 crest on it. The sight proved a slight measure of comfort until the next sign came into view, which indicated they were just 70 miles east of Wichita. Once again, Mike slowed the bus to a stop and turned to Robin and the other riders. "Robin," Mike began speaking, "unfortunately, I think we missed your exit by about 500 miles. Robin was dumbfounded and didn't know how to respond. Though he could offer no explanation, Mike rehashed the eerily similar events the night before, saying, "Last night, while traveling about 70, it took us several hours to cover less than 60 miles, and without warning, we somehow hopped from I-44 to I-70. Heck, we were just west of St. Louis, and before we knew it, we were close to Indianapolis. So I guess today is deja vu?" Charles interceded. "Folks, our country could be under attack. It's SOP for a defending army to swap the signs to confuse an invader. Maybe that's what's going on here." Byrne responded first. "Do you think America is under attack? And if so, by whom?" Charles answered, "My bet would be it's the Chinese. The Russian army is a paper tiger." Mike then added that an EMP attack was still a likely explanation for the power grid and cell phone networks going down. Robin's eyes bounced from each commentator to the next, as if she was watching a tennis match. But all she knew for sure is that she'd missed her exit and was apparently stuck on this bus with strangers who were telling her different things that made no sense. Normally, as quiet as Mary, Kim started weeping. Cassie moved to sit beside her and tried to console her. "What's wrong?" Cassie asked Kim, who responded by merely crying harder. By now the rain had stopped. Sensing that this might be a girls-only issue, Cassie demanded that Mike stop the bus and asked that he, Charles, and Byrne step outside to give Kim some privacy. Byrne whispered to Mike that he should probably take the key out of the ignition so the girls couldn't take off and strand them along the interstate. Mike knew Cassie would never do that and rolled his eyes at Byrne, but Charles muttered that Byrne had finally contributed something meaningful to their situation. Though Mike didn't think either comment was justified, he shut off the bus and slipped the key into his pocket before exiting. The girls' conversation went on for over an hour. Finally, Cassie opened the door to the bus and allowed the guys to board. While they were outside and out of earshot, Kim broke down and told Cassie, Mary, and Robin that Wichita was her home, but that she had to escape an abusive relationship by leaving her kids with her mom before disappearing. She said it was the hardest thing she'd ever done, and not a day went by when the guilt didn't eat away at her soul. While listening to the guys' theories about an attack of this or that nature, she knew some greater power was at work in returning her to Wichita to reunite with her kids. 2 exits later, Kim bounded off the bus and sprinted into the arms of her 2 children and her mother. No matter the cost, she was home to stay. She was still crying, but these were happy tears. As Charles moved towards the exit, intending to leave the bus to chat with Kim's mom about what she knew was happening abroad, Cassie grabbed his arm to restrain him, saying, "No, sir. Give them as much of this moment as they want. We'll find someone else to bring us up to speed." Mike couldn't help but crack a smile as he watched the former cop obey Cassie without objection. As the bus began rolling again, this time it was Mary's turn to cry, though she was much more composed than Kim had been. True to form, Cassie noticed the tears and sat beside her. All Mary said was, "Kim tried to forget who she was but couldn't, and I'm trying to remember who I am but can't." Cassie hugged her earnestly, which made Mary smile. With Charles sitting immediately behind him, Mike told him, "Maybe there's something more to this craziness than a cyber or EMP attack." Charles slowly nodded his head in agreement. Just a couple of minutes later, the fuel gauge suddenly dropped to near empty again. "I guess this next exit is us," Charles said after acknowledging the low fuel warning light. After taking the exit, the first building they came to was not a gas station, but rather a bridal shop with a sign that read, "La Bride." Smaller letters below confirmed that they were still in Wichita. Charles had observed Mike often looking at Cassie and knew that he admired her. To rag Mike, as well as let him know he was pulling for him, Charles leaned in and softly asked Mike if he wanted to do some shopping before they looked for gas. But before Mike could respond, Mary was once again pointing out the window, this time at 2 women who were standing in the parking lot of the bridal shop. One asked if the pair could catch a ride. Before Byrne could object, Cassie welcomed them aboard the bus and offered a handshake to each, saying, "I'm Cassie." The first woman replied that her name was Patricia, which ironically happened to be the name of the second gal as well. Byrne joked that it made it easier to remember, or forget, both names at once, which made the 2 Patricias laugh. Like Robin, they were unable to shed much light on the big picture, but were happy to catch a ride, being that neither of their cars would start. Mike was about to ask if they knew whether there was a working gas station in the area, until he noticed the gas gauge was now back to registering a nearly full tank once again. Showing Charles the reading, Mike spoke loudly for all to hear, saying, "Whatever is going on, I guess we're all in it together, whether we want to be or not." Suddenly, Byrne issued a warning, saying, "Guys, do you see this throng of people heading toward us? When they first saw us, they initially broke into a jog, and now they're sprinting, and they don't look too friendly." Charles asked the Patricias if they recognized any of the people. They did not, and seemed as concerned as anyone about the group's intent. I count over 50 of them, Byrne shouted. As Mike started the bus and punched the accelerator, it quickly pulled away from those in the front of the pack. These frontrunners seemed to be yelling for the bus to wait for them, as if they intended to board it. Kim's departure meant the original group of 8 from Merrimack Caverns was now 6. But with 3 new riders, there were not enough seats to come close to accommodating the mob that was urgently demanding transportation to or from something. Mike felt guilty for not filling the few empty seats, but suspected the situation would put his group at risk if the bus lingered. After escaping Wichita, the bus was seemingly still traveling west on I-70. However, that all too familiar disorientation set in once again when the next interstate sign said they were now heading east. As everyone settled into their seats, Charles mentioned to Mike that he needed to tell him something urgent but confidential. Chapter 4. 4 on the Floor. As the miles began to melt away, and with Wichita now far behind them, Byrne came forward to let Mike and Charles know that the men on the bus were now clearly in the minority. Charles agreed and said something to the effect of, "He's right. It's 5 to 2.5. Byrne took issue. "Hey, not funny," he shot back. Charles and Mike figured the bus was being guided east again. Both privately wondered if their ordeal was nearing an end. Thinking they likely had a long stretch on I-70 still ahead of them, Charles decided it was time to let Mike in on a little secret. He started the story with the disclaimer that what he was about to tell Mike might not be in any way related to the wild events that recently seemed to instantly teleport the bus and its occupants across vast distances. Charles then began his tale. "A few months ago, I was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Though I still loved my job, I decided to retire in order to enjoy the small amount of time I had left, but I became bored in no time at all. And after a night of heavy, self-medicating at a bar in Charleston near the station, I woke up on the steps of the hospital the next morning and had no clue how I got there." Mike tried to make light of the story to make it easy for Charles to continue, saying, "Maybe someone thought you needed to have your stomach pumped so you wouldn't die of alcohol poisoning." It was only when Charles continued his story that Mike realized he indeed was onto something. "Here's the thing," Charles continued, without laughing at Mike's intended humor. "It wasn't Charleston. I was in Nashville, on the steps of Vanderbilt Ingram Cancer Center." Mike asked, "How long ago was this?" 3 weeks ago, Charles answered. "So apparently we can't chalk that one up to an EMP or cyber attack." Mike paused before asking what the protocol was for Charles's cancer. He replied, "Man, the survival rate for my form of pancreatic cancer is less than 5%. I didn't like the odds. And I decided I didn't want to spend the time I had left hooked up to machines. So that's why I headed west to take this final vacation, which so far has been anything but relaxing." Mike wanted more details about possible cures. "What did your doctors in Charleston suggest?" Charles replied, "Vanderbilt Ingram. But I can't afford it, even if I wanted to. I'm a career cop, remember?" "What about insurance?" Mike inquired. "Well, I'm still on Blue Cross, but much of the medicine is so cutting edge that it isn't covered. And a tiny vial of some of that stuff costs over 5 figures. "How much would $100,000 get you?" asked Mike. "Why, you planning to rob a bank? If so, I'll have to throw you in the slammer, 'cause that's what I do," Charles kidded Mike, not realizing Mike was seriously considering writing a check. Before they could carry the conversation further, the gas gauge once again dropped quickly to just above empty. By now, they were near Terre Haute, Indiana. "We know the drill by now," Mike remarked as an exit ramp appeared in the distance. "I guess it's time to pick up another rider." Smiling at Byrne, Charles kidded him further, saying, "Or maybe we lose some excess baggage." This time, the bus ran completely out of gas and rolled to a stop with no buildings or businesses in sight. Charles decided Mike and Cassie should guard the bus while he and Byrne did some reconnaissance on foot. "Byrne, I'd give you a gun, but you almost permanently blinded me with that fire extinguisher. With a real weapon, you're more dangerous than the bad guys." Byrne smiled and beat his chest like Tarzan, saying, "I don't need a gun. I'm a lethal weapon." Charles laughed and replied, "Unfortunately for me, your confidence in yourself is not infectious." Mike was beginning to realize that under the hard surface, deep down, Charles seemed to enjoy his back-and-forth banter with Byrne. As the scouting party departed, Mike took a seat in the center of the bus in order to get a 360 view of their perimeter, in case more unwanted visitors appeared again. In theory, this was a decent plan, but when Cassie sat down beside him, his view, though pleasant, was obstructed. Soon everyone else on the bus was breathing deeply and seemed to be asleep. Cassie kicked off the conversation, saying, "I don't even know your last name." "Nor I yours," Mike replied, "but mine is Span." "And mine is Gaines," Cassie added. "You're not wearing a wedding band. Do you have someone?" "Yeah, I was married. Up until recently, that is. Married to my job that paid me well and sucked the life out of me. I guess you could say I'm trying to find myself." "What about you?" Mike asked Cassie. She answered, "I was in a long-term relationship with my high school sweetheart. We broke up recently as well, and I got my own place, but my hometown is tiny. Like you, I guess I'm also just trying to find myself." Mike realized his heart rate was elevated. He really liked this girl, but didn't want to let her know just yet for fear of scaring her off. But in addition to being good-looking as hell, Cassie was quite perceptive and not bashful in the slightest. "Despite the wild ride we've been on, I really don't want it to end," Cassie said. "That's because I'm the one driving the bus," Mike teased. With that, Cassie leaned over and kissed him on the cheek and whispered in his ear, "Not at the moment." "Shut up, Byrne. If there are bad guys out there, they'll know we're coming because of your incessant chatter," Charles pleaded. Suddenly, a building came into view. Though it looked abandoned, Charles thought he saw movement and dropped to one knee. Without having to be told, Byrne did the same thing. After several minutes of silent observation, Charles didn't see any activity and assumed that the movement he thought he saw might have been his imagination. As he and Byrne rose to their feet, there was indeed movement, but this time it was behind them, with two men each pointing a pistol at Byrne and Charles. Seeing Charles's holster, the taller of the two spoke first, saying, "That gun first, and then your wallet. You too, little man." Byrne indicated he didn't have either on him. The shorter highwayman then said, "Well, I guess we're just gonna have to fuck you up." Charles moved very deliberately as he threw his pistol near the men's feet. However, he made it seem as if the errant throw of his wallet was accidental, as he threw it several feet from the gun, hoping to create just enough of a distraction that he could retrieve his first backup pistol. However, before he could act, Byrne initiated a roundhouse kick to the arm of the bigger fellow pointing the gun at Charles and almost instantaneously used the other leg to kick the shorter man in the face, knocking him out cold. Before the bigger man could recover, Charles had his backup piece out and pointed it at the chest cavity of his former assailant. Byrne quickly picked up the guns on the ground and frisked the taller man first, and then the unconscious one. "Well, I'll be damned," exclaimed Charles while trying to suppress a toothy grin. "Where in the hell did you learn that move?" Byrne answered, "Never judge a book by its cover. I used that move against Paddy Pimblett and had him in trouble until he got me in a rear naked choke and I had to tap." "You're an MMA fighter?" Charles asked, still not believing what his eyes had just witnessed. "Yep. I'm 7'4" in the lightweight division. What about these two idiots?" The smaller man was beginning to regain his senses. Shaking his head, Charles wasn't ready to let go of what he had just witnessed. He couldn't have quit grinning even if a gun was still pointed at him. "We may be in luck," Charles said to Byrne, "but first I gotta ask, what was your MMA nickname?" "Byrne the Beast." "That's absolutely perfect," said Charles, as he pointed to the sign in the front of the building that indicated the business was an arts and crafts store. "I'm thinking there may be some rope in there. How about you check it out while I watch these two?" Charles then looked over to the tall guy and said, "Sit your ass down next to your partner, or I'll have my bodyguard kick your teeth out," Charles warned, still grinning from ear to ear. 10 minutes later, the two bad guys were sitting Indian style, tied to two different trees about 10 feet apart. "Let's get back to the bus," Charles said to Byrne. "Somebody will come along and free these two. Trust me, they're getting off easy." It probably wasn't a surprise when they returned to the bus and were introduced to yet another new rider. Though this one was male, he was even skinnier than Byrne and sported a long brown ponytail that made him look like a girl from behind. As the self-declared social director, Cassie introduced the returning scouts to Mick, who would have increased the number of new riders to 4, as well as provide another male for Cassie to tell what to do. After the euphoria disappeared from discovering that his friend Byrne, all 150 pounds of him, was an MMA fighter holding his own against the world's best fighters, Charles became strangely quiet. Mike could tell the wheels were turning in his head. "What's up?" Mike asked him softly so no one else could hear. Charles replied, "I'm not sure. I was trying to put the pieces of the puzzle together here, but the weirdness may be getting even weirder." Out of habit, Mike had been keeping his cell phone hooked to the car charger, though after 3 days with no signal, he'd all but quit checking it. With Mick now on board, the gas gauge miraculously returned to full status. But when Mike glanced at his fully charged phone, he saw that it still wasn't displaying any bars. "East or west? Who knows? But we're back in business on I-70, Mike proclaimed to his fare, which now numbered 8, excluding himself. But Mike would be wrong again. Rather than heading east or west on I-70, the bus was now heading due south along I-65. Or at least, that's what the road signs indicated. Nashville was suddenly only 30 miles away. Chapter 5. Mary had a lot of clams. As the bus entered Greater Nashville, the fuel gauge still registered a full tank. Though disengaged from the others, Mary seemed to be extremely interested in what she saw outside her window. For the first time in a while, she addressed Mike. "Take the Belmead exit, Mike." "Huh?" was Mike's bewildered response. Mary continued addressing Mike by saying, "I'll be getting off at my house. Take the next 2 lefts and then a right. My estate is at the end of the cul-de-sac." Charles whispered to Mike, "You think she's officially flipped her lid? I don't think there's a home in Belmead that's worth less than $3 million. Mary interceded. "I heard that, Charles. I hear everything, and it's probably closer to $4 million. Then Mary addressed the others, saying, "Thanks for keeping me company on this adventure, especially Cassie. You are an angel with a heart of gold. Mike, don't you let this one get away. She's definitely a keeper." Mary then turned to Byrne. "Byrne, I saw your fight against Patty. You had him. Why'd you let him take your back? And Charles, this next stop is yours as well. In the morning, my driver will take you to Vanderbilt Ingram. Dr. Sorensen is a dear friend of mine. I'll introduce you to tomorrow. And don't you worry. Under his care, your estimate of 5% survival rate is more like 50%. Mike, your most generous offer to Charles of $100,000 for his cancer treatment will not be necessary. I'll handle everything. And to our 4 new riders, I'm so sorry for your misfortune, but though it moves slowly, justice is coming." Mary exited the bus and entered a code into the security keypad, with the heavy iron gate swinging open at her command. Her house was awash with light, thanks to a series of backup generators. Realizing that she was legit, Mike prompted Charles to go with her. "This is your new lease on life, pal. Don't dilly-dally." Mary then let the group know one more thing, saying, "Oh, and I remembered my last name. It's Vanderbilt. Charles, you coming?" Charles seemed to be struggling with what everyone else figured would be an easy decision. He left his gear bag on the bus and momentarily exited in order to give Mary a big hug, saying, "From the bottom of my heart, I want to thank you, Mary, but I'll have to pass because I'm working on something bigger than me." Mary smiled and responded, "I know what you're working on, and you're close, very close. Finish it up and come right back here, because my offer stands." With that final remark, she blew a kiss to the bus and entered her mansion. When Charles returned to the bus, Mike asked him, "Are you sure about this? If she's a Vanderbilt descendant, your treatment will be less than a drop in the bucket to her. And she likely won't remember who you are if you leave and come back later." Charles replied, "We all have to die sooner or later. I've dedicated my entire career to law enforcement, and I wasn't cut out for retirement. This trip has put me back in the game." Mike shrugged his shoulders and said, "I hope you're making the right decision." "No doubt I am." Before they returned to I-65, Byrne blurted out, "I wonder where the hell we're supposed to go next." Charles responded to Byrne, saying, "If my theory is correct, we'll pick up our next rider in St. Charles, Missouri." "Never heard of it," remarked Byrne. Charles offered a 2-word response. "You will." When infinite darkness engulfed the bus for yet another night, Mike was pleasantly surprised to see that he had cell service. It was only momentary, but his phone started dinging like crazy as an accumulation of texts, emails, and voicemail notifications started coming through. Before he could retrieve any specific messages, he lost the connection again. Charles informed him that if the connection was reestablished, he needed to make an important call to the Indianapolis PD. Apparently, his request for the cell phone was merely wishful thinking because the service outage resumed. However, Charles's prediction that their next stop would be that small town in Missouri came true, and that's where they in fact picked up a 5th new rider. Her name was Nancy. Deciding to catch some sleep in St. Charles, Mike closed his eyes but couldn't sleep. He'd replay Cassie's kiss on his cheek 100 times in his mind, but something different, something ominous and just out of reach seemed to trouble him. His gut told him that Cassie was in peril. The next day, the sun came up and the brilliant blue sky contained what looked like a contrail from a plane. Maybe things were returning to normal, whatever that meant. For Mike, normal meant returning to a life without Cassie, and he didn't want that. By mid-afternoon, they were picking up yet another rider outside a store in tiny Raytown, Missouri, whose name was Sarah. "If I'm right, we're done picking up new riders and our next stop will be Indianapolis," Charles told Mike. Realizing his time in close proximity to Cassie might be coming to an end soon, Mike stopped the bus and encouraged everyone to stretch their legs. Soon thereafter, Cassie and Mike were alone on the bus. He locked eyes with her and he was about to make some bold proclamation when she cut him off, simply saying, "Yes." "Yes to what?" he asked her. She replied, "Yes to wherever you want to take me after this bus ride is finally done." Yes, yes, and yes. Their next kiss was much more than a peck on the cheek. Mike drew a deep breath afterward and said, "I've never met anyone like you before." "Mike Spann, don't you ever forget it," she replied, with a wide grin that was interrupted by another kiss, which was in turn interrupted by Charles clearing his throat. Then Byrne made his presence known by shouting, "Get a room!" Back on the bus and heading to Indianapolis as Charles predicted, by the time Mike saw the tire spike strips being pulled across the interstate, it was too late. Both front tires blew out simultaneously, causing the bus to swerve and almost tip over. Before it came to a complete stop, the vehicle was surrounded by a half-dozen armed highwaymen, some of whom carried automatic rifles. Charles instructed Cassie and Mike to quickly stash their handguns beneath their seats. Boarding the bus, the apparent leader spoke first. Seeing that Charles was armed, he pressed a pistol against Charles's temple and told a companion to frisk him. The search produced Charles's badge as well as 2 more concealed guns. "Search the others." After several minutes of process, the second gunman cried out, "They're clean!" The leader then turned his attention back to Charles while looking at his badge. "So, you're a cop? You're a far piece from Charleston. Are you some kind of rent-a-cop?" Charles answered, "I'm retired." Turning to Mike, the leader sarcastically asked if he was a tour guide. "I'm the only one who knows how to drive a stick shift," Mike replied, while noticing a couple of the goons seemed fixated on Cassie. The leader continued, "Here's the deal. We're taking the bus. Leave your gear and exit now." The new riders exited first, and as they did, Cassie stealthily retrieved her hidden gun and tucked it into her jeans. As Byrne moved towards the exit, one of the hijackers stopped him, saying, "Little man, you look familiar to me. Why is that?" "No clue. I wish I was famous, like Mr. Beast or Jake Paul." The deflection seemed to work. "Jake Paul's a pussy," the guy fired back. Once the 6 new riders and the 4 tourists were lined up outside the bus, things escalated when one of the gunmen grabbed Cassie's arm, saying to her, "How about you and me take a little walk?" Charles interceded. "You have the bus, you have our gear, and you have our money." Before he could finish his sentence, the leader clubbed Charles with his rifle, knocking him to the ground, but not unconscious. After he did, he told Charles, "We don't listen to cops." By now, Mike had positioned himself closer to Cassie. When the gunman most infatuated with Cassie grabbed her arm, Byrne stepped in front of him saying, "Don't do it, man." Pointing a gun at Byrne, the guy shouted, "Or what?" The distraction was all Cassie needed to pull her concealed pistol, which she pointed right at her would-be assailant's face. With one cat-quick sidekick, Byrne swept the legs from under one of the gunmen carrying an automatic rifle, who dropped it as he fell. Mike immediately picked it up and pointed it at the leader, who still had his gun trained on Charles. A Mexican standoff was in the making. You're outgunned, the leader told Mike and Cassie. True, but you're going to be the first one to die, Mike replied. None of this was necessary, by the way. Just leave us alone. What do you think, we'll just walk away when we have the upper hand? We need that bus and we're going to take it. Mick, the slender rider from Terre Haute, then produced the gun he saw Mike stash under the seat. Mike couldn't figure out how he got to it without being seen, but with it in hand, Mick further evened the odds. Suddenly, all hell broke loose. One of the bad guys on the perimeter squeezed off several rounds at Mick, who shot back at the guy and struck him in the forehead. As the shooter fell, he released the automatic rifle, which Byrne picked up and used to shoot two other hijackers. The leader then shot at Byrne, but was in turn killed by Cassie. Charles critically wounded the final two goons with a gun that the frisk search had missed. As the dust settled, Mike rushed to Cassie's side to make sure she was unhurt. She was unharmed, and initially, everyone else seemed to be okay as well, though Charles was sure that Mick had been struck with several bullets at the start of the firefight. Miraculously, he was unhurt. Byrne then spoke up by saying, "Folks, it's been fun, but apparently this is my exit." His torso had been shredded by automatic gunfire, and he collapsed onto the ground. There could be no rematch with Paddy Pimblett. Charles rushed to Byrne's side and tried unsuccessfully to revive him. 30 minutes later, he was still visibly shaken by the loss of his friend. After collecting himself, Charles picked up Byrne's body by himself and carried it onto the bus. After setting the body down on a seat, he then covered it with a jacket from his gear bag. Charles instructed Mike to help him change out the damaged front tires so they could get back on the road and away from the carnage. After walking to the front of the bus to assess the job, Mike mumbled to himself, "Why am I surprised?" He then called out to Charles, "The hits just keep coming. The tires are fine." With everyone back on the bus, an extended period of silence and reflection followed. Charles eventually leaned into Mike and whispered, "How's Mick not dead?" Mike asked Charles what he meant by the question. "I watched him take as much lead as Byrne did, maybe more. Byrne's dead, and this guy doesn't have a scratch on him. It just doesn't make any sense," Charles bemoaned. Though Mike concurred, he reminded Charles that from the first day they entered the damn bus, not much had. When Mike's cell phone started tinging once again, Charles grabbed it and initiated a call. Mike realized he was talking to someone in the Indianapolis Police Department. "Well, I'm on this bus, heading your way, but I don't know the transit time. Can you have that file ready for me whenever we get to you?" Charles ended the call and handed the phone back to Mike, explaining, "They're still using a backup generator, but the power grid is being restored. They said a massive solar flare is the cause." After what they'd been through, Mike shook his head, feeling certain that some greater cosmic force, potentially something sinister, was still in play. Maybe the answer would be found in Indianapolis. Chapter 6. Ghost Busted. The trip to Indianapolis was surprisingly uneventful. As the bus entered the metropolitan area, the power grid began functioning, with entire blocks seemingly coming to life in sync, with the arriving bus illuminating the way to the IPD headquarters. With so few vehicles on the road, Mike was able to park the bus directly in front of the station. Charles didn't wait for the bus to completely stop before jumping out and bounding up several concrete steps to the entrance of the building. The 6 new riders also left the bus in a hurry and disappeared without telling Mike or Cassie goodbye. HQ was bustling, with Charles figuring the extended blackout created a rich environment for crooks. An impatient man, Charles announced himself and fidgeted as he stood in the waiting area. Within 10 minutes or so, an older man approached and offered a handshake to Charles. Officer Barry, the guy addressed Charles. Call me Charles. I'm Officer Crook. Call me Jim. Charles smiled and thanked Crook for taking the time to see him. I understand you're semi-retired these days, Charles asked Crook. Just semi-paid. I still work long hours as a part-time investigator on a handful of cold cases, Crook added. I'm sorry I don't have that file you requested yet. It's been a little crazy around here, and I don't pull the same weight that I once did. Looking across the room, Crook called over to another officer saying, Hey, Craig, this is the detective from Charleston that called me about that cold case. You got a minute? When the guy replied affirmatively, Crook told him to bring his pad. Detective Charles Barry, let me introduce you to Detective Craig Shook. After the men shook hands, Crook asked Barry if he ever got ragged for his name back at CPD, but Charles gave him a blank stare for a response. Oh, come on. You never gotten grief about being named Charles Barry? As in Chuck Berry? Crook laughed as if he was as funny as Jimmy Fallon, but he wasn't done yet. Around here, we get called Shook and Crook, which is kind of like Shake and Bake or Starsky and Hutch. Charles thought to himself, I bet this white boy claps on 1 and 3, and pretended to laugh at Crook's joke, or whatever it was. Fortunately, Crook turned serious and explained that Shook was a sketch artist for IPD. Charles, describe the fellow you told me about to Craig. After just a couple of minutes of listening to Charles's description, Officer Shook showed Charles the drawing, who responded to it by saying, Holy shit, that's him. Maybe not quite as old looking, but yeah, that's him. About that time, a clerk handed Crook a file. In it was a similar sketch done years earlier. Showing it to Charles and the sketch artist in order to compare the drawings, all three simultaneously exclaimed, It's the same guy! Charles then asked if he could have a word in private with Investigator Crook. Speaking in soft tones, Charles knew he could only tell Crook bits and pieces of his recent adventures on the bus, though he knew he couldn't mention anything about the 6 new riders without running the risk of being locked up in a nut house. He did mention that Crook's suspect had ridden on the bus in the last seat and suggested a team dust for fingerprints and look for other evidence. He said his first name was Ben, no last name ever cited, and I'm certain that's not his real first name, Charles told Crook. I don't remember the exact exit where he got away from us, but I think it was near I-465. Crook exclaimed, Damn, this is unreal. You don't know the half of it, but why do you say that? Charles inquired. Because that first murder happened at a shoe store located at I-465 and Pendleton Pike, Crook answered. Was her name Robin? Charles asked. You been studying up on the case? Crook asked, impressed with Charles's knowledge of the victim's name. I remember when the bolo went out about a white male suspect in several killings along I-70, so yeah, you could say I'm familiar with it. More so lately, Charles answered. Soon, a forensics team assembled around them, which Crook asked Charles to escort to the bus. Almost a decade earlier, when Cassie was just out of high school, she took a job at a furniture store in her hometown of Miami, Oklahoma. Though she was an A student in high school, Cassie couldn't afford college and started working full-time the day after her graduation ceremony. She was an incredibly quick thinker and soon earned the trust of the store's owner, who began letting Cassie close out the cash register and process the daily deposits. Though Cassie was young, she wasn't naive. And because the store was doing a significant amount of cash sales, she obtained a license to carry a concealed weapon, which she took to work each day. Late one afternoon, a solitary customer, A slender man who looked to be in his 40s entered the store and immediately made Cassie uneasy. "Hi there. Looking for anything in particular?" she asked the guy, who seemed to be more interested in the store's layout than its inventory. "Just looking," the man replied, without making eye contact. Patting her concealed holster for reassurance, Cassie tried several times to make him look at her, but he avoided her eyes each time. Even though she was the only employee in the store, she called out as if two fellow employees were in the back area of the store. "Jim, Sarah, we're closing in 10 minutes. Then she put herself directly in front of the sketchy dude and asked, "Find anything of interest?" Still without looking at her, he shook his head as if to say no and left the store. Cassie immediately locked the door and called for her boyfriend to come get her, rather than walking home alone as she normally did. Over time, she forgot about the incident, until encountering Ben at the Merrimack Caverns. Though it didn't immediately register as being the same guy, something deep within Cassie's subconsciousness became disturbed. Back in Indianapolis, several fingerprints and some hair samples were collected from the bus, while Mike and Cassie relocated to the waiting area of the headquarters. When they entered the building, Charles introduced them to investigator Crook, who did a double take when he looked at Cassie. After directing the couple to the waiting area, Crook motioned for Charles to follow him to his office. As Crook closed the door, Charles asked him, "What's up?" From a thick file, Crook produced numerous photographs of the I-70 killer's victims before and after their murders and handed the photos one at a time to Charles. "Anything stand out?" he asked Charles. But before Charles could answer, Crook answered his own question by saying, "Brown hair, petite, young, Caucasian? Cassie could pass for any one of them." Charles replied, "I'm not sure I follow." "I'd be willing to bet he was stalking Cassie. She's lucky she was traveling with others." Charles's gut initially told him that Cassie's resemblance to the victims was just a coincidence, but as he thought about it, he was willing to keep an open mind. Even if it was a long shot, if the I-70 killer intentionally followed Cassie to Merrimack Caverns, she might need protection in Indianapolis, and she also might be used as bait. Cassie fell asleep in the waiting room area with her head on Mike's shoulder. He didn't want to move and wake her up and did his best to ignore the discomfort that came with sitting in the same position for an extended period. Occasionally, he was able to drift off to sleep for a brief cat nap. Mike was disoriented when Charles woke him to announce, "They got a hit on the hair sample. Just as I thought, the guy's last known address was here in Indianapolis. Detectives are headed there now to stake it out just in case he still lives there." Mike asked, "What's the guy's name?" "Roderick Ramsey," Charles answered. "No wonder he said his name was Ben. What do we know about him?" Mike inquired. "Not much. Late 50s, no known employment or relatives, nothing about his educational background, and no police record. Just a real nobody," Charles elaborated. "Maybe this crime spree is his sick way of becoming somebody. By the way, you look like you could use some coffee." "I could use a real bed," Mike replied, "and a shower." "Me too," replied Charles. "There's a Holiday Inn Express a block north of here and a cafe along the way. When Cassie wakes up, why don't we head over there?" During 48 hours of observation at Ramsey's last known residence, there was no sign of him. When investigators eventually knocked on the door, the occupants of the house indicated they'd lived there for nearly 5 years. When shown a sketch of Ramsey, neither had ever seen him. Before receiving the bad news that Ramsey was in the wind, Charles, Mike, and Cassie decided to check into the Holiday Inn Express. The banking system was slowly coming back online, but the hotel still couldn't process credit card payments, and its policy was that check-in required identification and a working credit card. Mike was miffed. Here's my ID, my valid credit card that your system can't process. We need rooms, Mike demanded. I'm sorry, Mr. Span. You're welcome to make yourself comfortable here in our lobby until the system gets up and running again, the clerk offered. Charles interceded and flashed his badge. All he said was, "What time do you get off work?" Reading something into the question, the clerk had a sudden change of heart. "Mr. Span, I presume you need 3 rooms?" Having been unusually quiet during the encounter with the clerk, Cassie indicated that 2 rooms would be sufficient. Though Charles contained his smile, he winked at Mike without Cassie noticing. Warren Reese was known as the White Rat by his unfortunate tenants. As the sole owner of Reese Realty, Reese operated several dozen rental properties on the seedy west side of Indianapolis. Most were barely habitable, and Reese had a nasty habit of threatening his tenants with eviction if they ever complained about any deficiencies. He also bribed code enforcement officers to falsify the results of compliance inspections whenever a tenant dared to file a formal complaint. No credit or background checks were necessary, so long as the applicant could pay the first 3 months upfront in cash. But if you were an attractive female and just a little short on the first payment, Reese devised other creative ways it could be satisfied. On 38th Street, in the shadow of Interstate 70, Reese owned a duplex that had once been a single-family home that he illegally subdivided by turning a basement with no windows into a cave-like efficiency apartment. Though Reese knew the basement had a history of flooding during heavy rains, that didn't stop him from turning it into living quarters. The first and only tenant to occupy the space was a guy who said his name was Ben Berkowitz, though Reese never asked him for any identification. Moreover, in the tenant rent roll ledger, Reese simply listed the guy as BB and didn't even remember what the initials stood for, or much else other than the guy typically paid in advance for several months at a time. Better still, he never once complained about anything when he showed up at Reese's office with a wad of cash. So to Reese, he was the perfect tenant. Though the unit above the basement apartment had a leaky roof and had been vacant for about a year, Reese was handed a thick envelope of cash by an attractive brunette who merely identified herself as Robin. She told Reese she was from the area and that she had been living with her parents until now. She also mentioned she had a job as a store clerk just a few miles from the apartment. Not really paying much attention to her story, Reese counted the cash in the envelope twice and was disappointed to see that Robin had the exact amount needed to leave with the key. As she left his office, Robin realized she'd neglected to tell the White Rat she planned on having 5 roommates. After an APB had been initiated by the Indianapolis PD for Ramsey, many leads came into the anonymous tip line, but none proved to be viable. Though cell service was not yet fully restored, the duration and frequency of outages decreased such that people could once again communicate in real time via text messaging. After camping out at police headquarters for the better part of 2 days, hoping to get a report on Ramsey's sightings and whereabouts, Crook promised to text Charles the minute they received a good lead. Cassie, Mike, and Charles then decided to head back to the hotel and get some rest. As he departed the elevator when it stopped at his floor, Charles suggested the 3 meet back up at the diner near the hotel for supper at 6 p.m. sharp. Mike and Cassie arrived at the cafe first and claimed a booth near the window that looked back toward their hotel. As they waited, they watched reports on the restaurant's television about the global impact of the massive solar flare. At 6:15, Mike sent Charles a text, kidding him about oversleeping. After Cassie scolded Mike for teasing Charles, Mike responded, "He told us 6 sharp. I couldn't pass up the opportunity to mess with him." When Charles still had not arrived by 6:30 and hadn't responded to Mike's text, both Cassie and Mike became concerned. The guy's never late. "I think I'll walk back to the hotel to check on him," Mike told Cassie. "Feel free to order if you're hungry." On the way back to the hotel, Mike saw Charles heading toward the diner about a half block away. Suddenly, Charles took a couple of quick strides to a garbage can along the street, the lid of which he opened. Immediately thereafter, he became violently ill and threw up repeatedly into the garbage can. Mike was sure Charles had not yet seen him, and he returned to the cafe, planning to act as if he'd been there all along. A few minutes later, a gaunt-looking Charles sat down with them at the booth and apologized for being late. "I was on the phone with HQ, and I didn't see the time. Unfortunately, still no leads." For the first time, Mike realized just how sick Charles really was. Posturing, Mike asked if Charles had spoken with Mary since the phones were working again. "Why you asking?" Charles answered, seemingly annoyed at Mike's inquiry. Mike shrugged his shoulders as if he was simply asking a question and replied, "Well, it may take several days, weeks, maybe even longer to get a lead on Ramsey's whereabouts. I was just thinking you might want to use the downtime to go meet with Mary's doctor friend in Nashville. Might be helpful to hear what he has to say about a potential treatment to kick your cancer in the ass. We can hold the fort down here for a couple of days." "I'm good. Better than ever. This investigation has me feeling like a kid again," Charles lied. Mike persisted. "Even if they find Ramsey and arrest him, Crook will keep him on ice till you can interrogate him. What's the drive up from Nashville? Only about 4 hours?" Growing more annoyed, Charles said, "I want to be the one that arrests that son of a bitch and puts cuffs on him." Mike decided to back off and asked if Cassie had decided what she wanted to order. She wasn't sure, but said several items on the menu looked good. Noticing that Charles wasn't remotely interested in the menu, Mike asked him, "You hungry?" "Nope, I'm good," he answered. Mike tried to make a joke and a point at the same time by responding, "Ramsey may not be a whippersnapper, but he's not an old fart like you either. You might need to eat something to have the strength to chase him if he tries to run." "If he runs, I'll just shoot him," Charles answered, but without smiling or laughing. Later, after Cassie ordered appetizers, when the waitress brought them to the table, Charles excused himself and headed to the men's room. While Charles was in the bathroom for an extended period of time, Mike told Cassie, "I'm calling Mary to get her cancer doctor friend's contact information." Mary picked up just after the second ring. "Hello," Mary answered. "Hi, Mary. This is Mike. Cassie's here too and says hello." "Who?" Mary asked. "Mike and Cassie. I'm calling you to get the contact info for your friend, the cancer doctor, so I can persuade Charles to call him." "Who?" Mary asked again. "This is Mary, but I think you have the wrong number. At the moment, I can't remember my last name." Mike ended the call before Charles returned to their booth. "You okay?" Mike asked, since he'd been gone so long. "Never been better. Just checked in with Crook for an update," Charles lied again. In his basement apartment, Ramsey was aware that there were new neighbors above him. It sounded like several different people were walking across the hardwood floors that doubled as his ceiling. Each time they moved from one part of the place to another, it creaked. Other than occasional gunfire in the neighborhood, Ramsey was accustomed to dead silence in the basement dwelling and hoped he could acclimate to the moaning floors and occasional slamming doors above. For the time being, he was annoyed by the new tenants, who seemed to stay in perpetual motion. By 4 a.m. of that first night, Ramsey put on his black hoodie and banged on the front door of the apartment above, to demand that his neighbors settle down so he could finally get some sleep. Not a single light was on inside, and nobody responded to his knocking. But he hoped his visit would make them realize someone was living below them. However, as soon as he returned to his own place, the creaking noises remained at full-pitch fever, as if they had never stopped. Sticking his head between two pillows, Ramsey figured he'd give those people a piece of his mind in a few hours when daylight returned. After another hour of tossing and turning, he gave up trying to sleep and turned on a bedside lamp. The light illuminated an entire wall, plastered with crime scene photos of 6 murder victims. 5 were of women, and a 6th was of a slender man with a ponytail that looked more like a woman than a man. On the opposite wall, photographs were printed of the 6 victims before they were killed. They seemed to favor one another. That wall included multiple pictures of a 7th female, leaving a furniture store looking like she was still a teenager. Then in various locations, looking like a person more in her 20s. The last picture in the series was taken of her standing in front of a sign that read, Merrimack Caverns. Though Ramsey was a minimalist, he was a neat freak, and he kept the place in order. After making up the bed, he sent a photo recently taken from his phone to his color printer, which then regurgitated it. He grabbed it and then pinned another picture of the same woman entering the Holiday Inn Express in downtown Indianapolis on the wall. Daylight did nothing to slow the obnoxious activity Ramsey was enduring from the apartment above. "Don't these people ever sleep?" he asked himself. By mid-morning, he could take it no longer. He slipped on his hoodie again and grabbed an unusual-looking pistol from the drawer of his nightstand, slipping it into the hand-warmer pocket of the hoodie. Despite his persistent knocking on the door, nobody in the apartment responded. So Ramsey decided to walk around the side of the house and rap on one of the windows. Upon observing that there were no blinds or curtains, he cupped his hands to shield the glare and peered into the empty room. When nobody responded to his rapping on that window, he went to another and repeated the process. Though he was now looking into a different room, it was also empty. Frustrated that nobody was responding to him, he walked back to the front door and beat on it even harder, suffering the same result. Placing his hand on the door handle, he turned it slightly and realized it was unlocked. Cracking the door slightly open, Ramsey cautiously stuck his head into the house and yelled, "Hello, I'm your downstairs," before prematurely ending his announcement when he realized that there was nobody home. Walking through the entire apartment, there was not a stick of furniture or a sign of anyone living in the place. He was dumbfounded. Returning to and entering his basement dwelling, the noises from above continued, unabated. Furthermore, Ramsey noticed that several of the pinned crime scene photos were missing. Maybe the people above him were drug addicts? He looked around his apartment to make sure nothing of value was taken. Then he realized that the missing photographs were all of the same woman, who had been murdered in Indianapolis years earlier. She was 26 when she was killed, and her name was Robin Fuldauer. Chapter 7. Demons. Charles was beginning to feel lightheaded. It had been over 48 hours since he'd been able to eat anything without throwing it back up. And though he wasn't hungry, he knew he needed to get some calories into his system. He debated whether to invite Cassie and Mike to join him once again, and ultimately decided to go alone. When the waitress came to take his order, he ordered coffee and 2 sides, hash browns and grits, thinking they'd be bland and therefore more agreeable to his digestive system, and high in calories. As soon as he ordered, Crook called him and asked if he was still at the hotel. I'm across the street at the cafe. What's up? Charles inquired. Nothing dramatic. Just some potential new leads I wanted to run by you. Mind if I join you? Crook asked and continued, I can be there in 10. Not at all, but I just ordered. Want me to order something for you? Crook replied, I've already eaten breakfast, but I don't want to make you feel awkward eating in front of me, so sure. How about ordering me some scrambled eggs, cheese grits, and hash browns? Assuming Crook was finished, Charles waved at the waitress. When she returned to his table, Crook was still talking. Bacon and 2 pancakes. Charles sarcastically asked if Crook wanted biscuits or toast. Oblivious to the dig, Crook chose toast. Anything else? Charles asked. That's good. I don't want to ruin my appetite for lunch, Crook concluded. When the waitress took Charles's initial order, she memorized it and recited it back perfectly. When she returned and asked if he needed anything else, Charles told he would be having a friend join him who wanted to order in advance. Sure thing. What'll they be having? Charles suggested she get out her pen and pad. Crook's timing was perfect, having arrived just as the waitress returned with both orders. Charles shook his hand and took a few bites of his breakfast. What about those potential leads? Charles asked Crook, who seemed to be inhaling his food. Often speaking with a full mouth of food, Crook replied, The profiler has identified 7 likely areas within a 10-mile radius of downtown where a guy like this might feel he could blend in. We're pulling security footage from several grocery, liquor, and convenience stores in each neighborhood, looking at anyone wearing a dark hoodie or that comes even close to matching Ramsey's description. The minimum loops range from 30 to 180 days, so there's a ton of footage. Investigator Shook and I haven't even scratched the surface yet, but we're already becoming cross-eyed. I was wondering if you, Cassie, and Mike might be willing to spend some time at the station to help us out. Charles nodded and indicated that he'd be happy to help. I can't speak for the 2 lovebirds, but I'll text them both and ask. Charles was able to eat most of the grits and about half of the hash browns before running out of steam. Crook had a happy plate and ordered another cup of coffee while they waited for a response from Cassie and Mike. Though they were different in many ways, Charles sensed a growing connection with Crook. Both were career cops that didn't want to retire. Both loved their jobs and did them to the best of their abilities day in and day out. But neither had been credited with actions that saved the day or solved a high-profile case that they'd be remembered for in years to come. That ate at Charles. Why didn't you stay retired? He asked Crook. Normally an impulsive talker, Crook hesitated for what seemed like a long time before he finally answered. I have 3 ex-wives who claim I love being a cop more than I love being a husband. My kids are grown and have families of their own. I hate to fish, and I suck at golf. I want to work until I die. I just hope the damn job isn't the reason I die. To Charles, this comment was the first quip from Crook that genuinely made him laugh. Crook then asked, What about you? The normally reflective cop from Charleston offered an immediate answer. I would have retired years ago, but I never broke that one case that people will be talking about long after I retired, or even after I'm dead and gone. I'm still chasing that case. And you think Ramsey is that case? Crook asked. I guess it could be, but don't worry. I'll give you and Shook credit where credit is due, Charles joked, causing both men to laugh yet again. Is there a case that still haunts you? Crook asked. Once again, Charles didn't need time to ponder the question. There was this case Way back in September of 1989, I was just a rookie. Rich family in the historic district of Charleston. You remember Hurricane Hugo? Winds from it were recorded at 155 miles per hour, tore up everything in its path. On its approach, we got a 911 call about a missing kid. Beautiful blonde 12-year-old daughter of some corporate bigwig. I was dispatched to the house, but my squad car stalled in the streets that were flooded by storm surge. Dispatch ordered everyone back to HQ to hunker down until it was safe to be out in it again. That took 3 days. When I finally got to the house, the couple was hysterical. The husband was livid, and the missing girl's mother slapped my face and cursed me. A huge oak tree had fallen onto the house, and big limbs penetrated the upper floor of the home, including the daughter's bedroom. The impact and the rain that followed erased any clues or leads that we may have obtained if I had gotten there when the call came in. It messed with me so badly, I almost quit the force back then. Crook asked what would have happened if the little girl had been in the bedroom when the oak tree crashed into it. That's why the mother slapped me. The little girl's bed was crushed, and I was trying to calm her down by suggesting it was maybe a blessing that her daughter wasn't in the room at the time. After she slapped me, she screamed that I obviously didn't have kids because I'd understand that at least she wouldn't have to worry any longer, Charles explained. Do you have kids? Crook asked. No, she was right. I wish I'd never opened my damn mouth. Crook asked if the girl's body was ever found. Not a trace. The couple ended up moving to Atlanta, and I eventually quit communicating with them, Charles replied. Were the parents ever suspects? Crook asked. We had to consider every possibility, but I will never forget the look of utter despair and sheer terror on their faces when I first saw them. You can't fake that, and they were quickly eliminated as potential suspects. The weird thing is that no ransom demand was ever made. It was as if the hurricane sucked that little girl right out of the house, Charles continued. What about you? What still eats at you? Crook took a deep breath and labored to tell Charles he lost a partner once who was shot at point-blank range while sitting in the squad car waiting for Crook to return from taking a dump inside a convenience store. I was the reason he was a sitting duck in that cruiser, Crook lamented. To this day, I rarely take a shit without thinking about that night. Charles asked if they ever arrested the killer. No, but we identified the gang who was behind the hit, Crook answered, saying that there was no need for an arrest. Charles understood what that meant. Charles felt his phone vibrating. The screen was displaying Mike's name. Charles answered the call saying, Where are you and Cassie? Mike replied, We're actually back at the police station. Apparently, somebody stole the shuttle bus that we parked right in front of IPD. The hell you say? Charles noticed the curious look on Crook's face, who was wondering what was being said. Any chance your parking Nazis would have called for our shuttle to be towed? Charles asked Crook. Let me check into it. I'll ask Shook, but ask Cassie and Mike to stay there and wait for us. I'll give you a ride, Crook told Charles. Feeling a little nauseous, Charles declined. It's close enough for me to walk. I need to think about my girlish figure, and maybe you should too, Charles kidded Crook. That was the other thing my 3 ex-wives all claimed, Crook replied. Waving for the waitress to bring the check, Crook told Charles breakfast was on him, and he'd see him back at the station. Less than a block into his walk there, Charles had to duck into an alley to vomit. Even the grits wouldn't stay down. Crook greeted Mike and Cassie as he returned to headquarters and confirmed that no one in IPD had towed the bus. While they waited for Charles to arrive on foot, Crook enlisted the couple to start reviewing the video footage that everyone hoped might tighten the noose on Roderick Ramsey. In the alley, Charles seemed to vomit much more than the small portion of grits and hash browns he'd just consumed at breakfast. This time, the nausea was so intense he nearly passed out. In a rare pause, from one knee, he looked up to see the shuttle bus parked at the end of the alley. But before he could rise to his feet to investigate, another wave of vomiting hit him. Thinking he was delirious or had passed out, the next thing Charles remembered was that he was sitting alone in the driver's seat of the parked bus. Moments later, the shuttle's door opened and a young rider boarded. She looked to be about 12 and had blonde hair. Charles remembered thinking, she was cute enough to be a child actor. Then he realized she looked much like the pictures of the little girl who had seemingly vanished into thin air so long ago during Hurricane Hugo. Still in a fog, Charles didn't know how to react to the little girl's presence on the bus, or even what to say to her. After she sat down in the closest seat, she spoke first. He had a summer job working for the company that cleaned our pool that summer. He had just quit to get ready to go back to college. He attended the College of Charleston. He was in a fraternity. It was Sigma Chi. But as the hurricane approached, he used the cover of the thunder, rain, and the howling wind to break a first-floor window to get into our house. The storm was so intense, my parents didn't hear anything as he walked up the stairs, heading for my room. I screamed before he could put his hand over my mouth, and I screamed when he me as loud as I could. But the storm was so intense it drowned out my screams. I was still conscious when he picked me up and threw me out of my window. But I survived the fall, so he jumped to get me in case I got up and tried to run. But I couldn't make my legs move. During the summer, he lived with his parents just a block away on 6th Street. They were on vacation in Europe, and he was only a child, staying in the house alone when they were gone. He threw me over his shoulder and took me to his house. I was now screaming because I was in intense pain, but that didn't stop him from raping me once again once we were inside. I guess I died shortly thereafter, but remained suspended above my body as he wrapped me in a brown bedspread and put my body in the back of his family's Toyota Land Cruiser. It had 4-wheel drive, which allowed him to get through the flooded streets far enough to dump my body into the bay. Realizing that there would be absolutely no surviving evidence to convict a perpetrator after the crime scene was washed away, and so much time had elapsed. Charles could think of only one single question. "What was his name?" The little girl answered, "Johnny. But these days, just John." "Sweetheart," Charles replied, "what was his last name? Do you remember?" "Of course I do," she resolutely replied. "Barrington. John Barrington." Charles's heart skipped a beat. "Councilman Barrington? John Barrington that is now a city councilman?" Charles asked in astonishment. "Yes, sir. That's him. And before I died, I took this," the girl continued, as she handed Charles a Sigma Chi crest and chain, with the initiation number 507 engraved on the backside of the crest. Charles's mind was racing. He needed to get back to Charleston as quickly as possible, but his thoughts were interrupted by the young girl. "I wasn't the only one," she continued. "There are other girls buried on his hunting property near Cottageville. They are in a single grave near a big live oak tree on the south property line. My parents live in Meridian now, in the country club estates. Tell them not to worry about me anymore, and that I love them." When Charles fully regained his senses, he was in an ambulance, being rushed to Health Methodist Hospital, just north of downtown. He convinced himself that he'd had a wild dream and reached in his pocket for his phone so he could call Cassie and Mike to let them know He'd had a minor spell, but instead of pulling out his phone, he pulled out a pendant and chain. On the front side of the pendant was a fraternity crest, and on the back side, the number 507 was engraved. Despite the flashing lights and wailing siren, the ambulance had to contend with near-normal traffic volume en route to the ER. At a particularly congested intersection, the back door of the ambulance flew open, and its passenger disappeared. The driver and aide watched in amazement as their 911 patient effortlessly sprinted through traffic towards a Hertz rental car building. "Maybe he doesn't like being hooked up to tubes and monitors," one said to the other. "Can you blame him?" the other replied. When Mike's caller ID showed Charles's incoming call, he answered by asking with concern, "Where the heck are you? We've been worried sick about you." Cassie could only hear Mike's end of the conversation as he exclaimed, "You're heading back to Charleston? In a rental car? What the hell, Charles? Are you sure you're all right?" "Never been better," Charles replied. "And tell Crook he'll find the stolen shuttle bus in an alley 2 blocks east of the diner. Listen, I better go. I'm getting pulled over by a state trooper for doing over 100 miles per hour on the interstate." "Maybe you should let him talk to Investigator Crook before we hang up," Mike suggested. "No need. The trooper will probably be arranging for me to have an escort when he hears why I'm speeding. Listen, I'm not sure when I'll see you and Cassie again, so I want you to know you two have made my little vacation one of the best I've ever had. Mike, do you remember what Mary said when she told you not to let Cassie become the one that got away?" Mike answered that he did remember what she said. "You better marry that girl," Charles yelled into the phone just before ending the call. Crook had a bewildered look on his face as Mike recanted the entire phone conversation to him and Cassie. As for locating the stolen bus, Crook looked over to a fellow IPD investigator, Shook, and said, "I guess we'll need to give him credit for helping us solve the case of the disappearing bus. But as for Ramsey, that's now exclusively our bus to make." Chapter 8. More Demons. Ramsey's main mode of transportation for trips around the neighborhood, involving any distance, was a Jensen hybrid bike. He needed to clear his head and come up with a logical explanation for the noises coming from the vacant apartment, and felt a mid-afternoon ride would do him some good. On the way home, he planned to pick up a few essentials at the Dollar General. After a 90-minute ride and a quick stop, he returned to his basement apartment. No more noises were coming from above, and the missing photographs were all back in place. Ramsey figured that a bout with insomnia was making him delirious. However, later that evening, he noticed that one of the pre-crime scene photos was now initialed with the letters RF. He was pretty sure he'd never noticed that before, and as he laid down to try and get some sleep, the noises from above started back louder than ever. In addition to creaking floors, at the top of every hour, the sound of breaking glass against the floor further disturbed him. Once again, he grabbed his pistol and went outside, ready for a confrontation. Exiting his apartment, the door suddenly slammed behind him, and he realized he was locked out of his own place. "Fucking crackheads!" he cursed out loud, returning to his own door. When he was unable to open it, he shot out the deadbolt and kicked the door in after chambering another round. The gun was a vintage Irma Vark .22 caliber German pistol from World War I that Ramsey had stolen from a vintage gun show 2 decades earlier. He loved the thing. Ramsey quickly determined that nobody was inside the apartment, yet all the pictures of murder victims previously pinned to the wall were now tossed about the room, with most either on the floor or on his bed. Only the pictures of the girl from Miami, Oklahoma were still pinned to the wall. including the photograph he'd recently taken of her in downtown Indianapolis. First noticing a depression in his pillow, as if someone had laid across his bed, he then noticed blood stains on it. Gathering up the photos, Ramsey noticed that every one of them was now signed or initialed. When the clock hit midnight, the sound of breaking glass above him prompted Ramsey to fire several shots into the ceiling. "Fuck you!" he screamed as he looked up at the fresh bullet holes. "Fuck every last one of you! You can't touch me! You're dead! And I'm not, and there's not a damn thing any of you can do about that!" Realizing he could no longer lock his own door or spend another night in the apartment, Ramsey decided to check into a hotel. Why not? He asked himself, intending to check into the Holiday Inn Express where Cassie and Mike were still staying. Those two had been poring over footage for hours when Cassie did a double take on some from a Dollar General located on the west side. "That's him!" she screamed. Crook sprang into action, and the task force was immediately consolidated and redirected to the immediate area around the store. Crook also received a report of a 911 call about gunfire coming from inside a vacant rental property a few blocks from the Dollar General. He and Detective Shook raided the weapons locker and donned body armor and police helmets. "You two stay here," he told Cassie and Mike. There was a solitary 65-inch television that was always on in the waiting area of police headquarters, though the volume was usually set very low. As Crook exited, Mike noticed a breaking story from Charleston, South Carolina, that was interrupting the regular programming. The picture first showed an excavator emptying a bucket of dirt retrieved from a freshly dug pit. The caption stated that the scene was from a rural location near the small town of Cottageville, South Carolina. It then cut away to the historic district of Charleston, where multiple police vehicles with flashing lights were arrayed outside a private residence located on 6th Street. As the camera panned closer, a suspect in handcuffs was being escorted from the house into a waiting police cruiser. Cassie was the first to notice that Charles was firmly grasping the suspect's armpit as a title appeared that read, "Charleston City Councilman arrested on suspicion of multiple counts of murder." "Well, I'll be damned," Mike muttered. "Congratulations, Charles, you tenacious son of a bitch." Charles Berry finally had his legacy case. He passed away from complications associated with pancreatic cancer just a month later. Both Mike and Cassie were exhausted and decided to walk back to the hotel, figuring Crook would call them if and when Ramsey was arrested. Meanwhile, Shook and Crook were now on a connecting street in a seedy neighborhood that bordered Interstate 70. As they turned onto 38th Street, they were flagged down by a local resident who pointed to the house where she'd heard the gunfire. She said although gunfire in the neighborhood was a common occurrence, this time it was ridiculously close to her house. "Take a break from writing tickets and get a handle on this situation," she demanded. Armed to the teeth, when the two detectives noticed that the door to the lower level of the building was kicked open, they requested and waited for backup. A second cruiser quickly arrived on the scene, and Crook burst into the apartment. "Clear!" he yelled to Shook and the other officers after realizing that Ramsey was not home. "Check upstairs," Crook called to the others, who soon replied, "Clear! It's vacant!" With no perp at the residence, investigator Shook began photographing the scene. But it was Crook who first realized the pictures still pinned to the wall were of Cassie. When he looked at the one taken of her entering the Holiday Inn Express, he exclaimed, "Shit! He knows Cassie's at the hotel! Call it in!" After Mike and Cassie arrived back at the hotel, Cassie decided she'd grab a Diet Coke from the vending machines and asked Mike if he wanted anything. He didn't, and as she walked by the front desk, she became engaged in a conversation with the night clerk, who Cassie thought was lonely. She told Mike to head up to the room and that she'd be up in a few minutes. Mike got on the elevator and punched in the number 7 for their floor. Mike remembered hearing the key card unlock the door, but nothing further. When Cassie arrived at the room, Mike had been knocked unconscious and his gun had been taken from him. Ramsey was sitting in an oversized chair near the window, pointing the vintage gun at Cassie and Mike's pistol at Mike. "If you bolt, I'll put 2 bullets in your boyfriend's brain. Close the door, Cassie." Cassie noticed Ramsey still refused to make direct eye contact with her. He continued, "You don't know how many times you've almost died. At one point, I began to think you had a guardian angel. But I guess that's not the case now, is it?" Cassie managed to stay calm, partially due to the fact that she still carried the Glock in her purse, but was hesitant to lunge for it just yet. "Ben, or is it Roderick?" Cassie asked Ramsey, who replied, "Tonight, it's the Grim Reaper," he continued. "Compared to you, the others were easy. Lambs to the slaughter. But I knew this night would eventually come." Slowly stooping to set her purse down on the floor, Cassie straightened back up and asked, "Why did you do it? Why did you kill those women up and down I-70? Seemingly proud of his accomplishments, Ramsey reminded Cassie that he killed a guy, too, but admitted he thought that the victim was a woman until it was too late. Ramsey continued, "You do realize all of this is your fault, don't you?" Cassie intended to keep Ramsey talking for as long as she could while waiting for an opportunity to grab her own gun. When she laid her purse on the floor, she intentionally situated it in a way that made it easier to reach into. "How's this my fault?" she asked Ramsey. "Because they all reminded me of you. You were supposed to be my first victim. But there's a silver lining," Ramsey stated. "And what's that?" Cassie asked. "Well, I've developed a bit of notoriety as the I-70 killer. If I killed you so far from my usual hunting grounds, I'm not sure the press would have given me credit. In the end, it helps that I'm a patient man, because it looks like everything will work out just fine," Ramsey proclaimed. Cassie had no doubt that this lunatic intended to kill her, and Mike too, so she decided to reach for the gun at the first opportunity. At the very least, she'd go down fighting. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door, which clearly alarmed Ramsey, who slipped the 2 guns under his hoodie but kept them pointed at Cassie. "Tell them you didn't order room service," Ramsey commanded. "Cassie, this is Robin," called a voice from the hall. "Now's not a good time, Robin. Can you come back later?" The voice outside acknowledged the request, and the unwelcome visitor seemed to go away. Cassie was mad at herself when she realized that she might have missed her best opportunity to use the distraction to go for her gun. Ramsey wasn't quite ready to kill Cassie and rambled on about how he had managed to outsmart the police for over 2 decades and could kill with impunity whenever and wherever he wished. "This sick bastard thinks he's invincible," Cassie thought to herself. Having enough of his boasting, Cassie decided to throw him a curveball. "Can I ask you something?" she said to Ramsey. "You mean like a final request or something?" Ramsey sneered. "I guess," Cassie replied. "That first time, in the furniture store, why couldn't you look me in the eyes?" The question seemed to knock Ramsey off his high horse. "I don't know what you're talking about," Cassie continued. "I think you do. It was the same at Merrimack Caverns, and later on the bus." "You're full of shit," Ramsey said to Cassie. "If I am, then right before you kill me, look me in the eyes, Roderick." "Don't call me that, you little bitch. I'm the I-70 killer to you." Cassie noticed that Ramsey's hands were shaking. She continued belittling him by saying, "All right then, Mr. I-70 killer, just look me in the eyes." Ramsey no longer wanted to converse with his intended victim. He tensed his body in anticipation of pulling the trigger and shutting her up once and for all. At that moment, someone began knocking on the window behind Ramsey, who exclaimed, "I wasn't aware these rooms had a balcony. Just don't answer or say a word." Cassie knew there was no balcony, only 7 stories of air above the ground. The knocking persisted. Suddenly, a female voice, the same voice that had previously been at the door and asked for Robin, began speaking again, saying, "Roderick, this is Robin. I'm actually here to see you." Cassie noticed Ramsey's entire body was shaking now, but still had both pistols pointed at her. Robin continued talking. "I autographed those photographs you had of me back at your place, and I invited some of my friends over. You remember the 2 Patricias, don't you? And Nancy? And don't forget Mick. We all came to see you. We want to be your friends." Not able to stand Robin's teasing any longer, Ramsey turned his back on Cassie, intending to shoot through the window, and as soon as he turned toward the window, Cassie reached for her Glock. "Roderick, turn around and look me in the eyes," she yelled to the I-70 killer, who pivoted in order to shut Cassie up by shooting her. At that moment, the watch Cassie was wearing dinged with a barely audible chime to announce the arrival of the witching hour. Cassie pulled the trigger first and shot Ramsey in the chest. The force of the impact knocked him out of the 7th floor window, which made a deafening sound as it crashed into hundreds of shards. Regaining consciousness, Mike rubbed the back of his head and asked what he'd missed. Cassie simply replied, "Call the front desk. I think we need to change rooms." Suddenly, detectives Shook and Crook burst into their hotel room from the hallway with guns drawn. Like Charles Berry a day earlier, investigator Jim Crook finally solved his legacy case, and the I-70 killer joined his victims in the afterworld. They were waiting for him. The real case of the I-70 killer is still unsolved. If you have any information related to the actual case, please call 800-800-3510. The victims deserve real justice. Postlude. In the skies over Meridian, Mississippi, on the afternoon of October 20th, 1977, a twin-engine CV-240 transport plane en route to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, from Greenville, South Carolina, encountered a problem with its right engine, which sputtered to a stop. The engine had a recent history of problematic issues, none the least of which involved excessive fuel consumption. The plane could be flown on a single engine, but as the pilot attempted to transfer fuel from the disabled right engine to the functional left engine, he accidentally dumped the remaining fuel from both engines, sealing the fate of the plane, its crew, and its passengers. This book is dedicated to the memory of one of those passengers who had serious reservations about the airworthiness of the plane, as well as the competency of its crew before the doomed flight. After purchasing a ticket to the same destination on a commercial airline, against her better judgment, she was ultimately persuaded by her boss to scrap the alternative travel arrangements. Just 29, she was rapidly emerging as a force to be reckoned with in her field. But her meteoric rise to certain stardom ended tragically in a debris field deep within a remote Mississippi swamp near the tiny Mississippi town of Macomb. Her name was Cassie Gaines, and her boss was none other than Ronnie Van Zant. This book is also dedicated to another American hero. The date was November 25th, 2001, and America was still reeling from the horrific and unprovoked terrorist attack that brought down the Twin Towers in New York and flattened the West Wing of the Pentagon. The subject was part of an elite American team that went to Afghanistan to identify and to bring to justice the architects of the attack. Near the town of Mazar-e-Sharif in northern Afghanistan, a number of captured Taliban prisoners were being held and interrogated by a coalition of forces that sought to overthrow the Taliban in Afghanistan. One of the prisoners, an American trader named John Walker Lind, also known as the American Taliban. Lind's treachery aided an uprising that pitted just a half-dozen American operatives against over 100 extremists. One of those operatives was a 32-year-old member of the CIA from Winfield, Alabama, whose heroic last stand allowed the rest of his team to form a defensive perimeter and successfully repel the horde of attackers. After emptying the clip of his Glock 19 pistol, Johnny Michael Mike Spann overpowered an attacker and ripped the Kalashnikov automatic assault rifle from his grasp to take out still more attackers. Though Spann ultimately succumbed to multiple gunshot and stab wounds, he took close to 36 Taliban combatants with him and became the first American casualty in Afghanistan.
Meridian.